couple of days before the Japanese Grand Prix, I moved the news to this week because that video was already getting a bit long, the F1 world said goodbye to Innes Ireland, who had competed in 53 Grand Prix between 1959 and 1966. He spent much of his F1 career driving Lotus cars, either for the works team or as a privateer, and finished fourth in the World Championship in his second year, 1960, before suffering a broken leg and qualifying for Monaco in 1961. He recovered to win the non-championship Solitude-Rennen and Flugplatzrennen later in the year and capped the season with his only championship win at Watkins Glen, but was sacked at the end of the year so his team could put all its resources behind Jim Clark. Editing Matt here, I've just realised I completely failed to mention that this win was not only the first for a Scottish driver, but also the first for Team Lotus. He moved to the British Racing Partnership team, set up by Stirling Moss's father and manager, with whom he would go on to score a few points over the years, but never again stood on a championship podium, though he did win some domestic non-championship races for them. Ireland had married his third wife, Jean Mander, who'd been Mike Hawthorne's fiancée when he died in 1958, earlier in 1993, but he'd also seen recent tragedy when one of his three sons, Jamie, committed suicide the year before. The newspaper The Herald called him the Scot called Ireland who was born in England and lived in Wales. Southern California burned in late October as a series of 14 separate fires, collectively known as the Southland Firestorm, ravaged the area after a long, hot summer following a wet winter, which meant there was even more dry tinder than usual. The Laguna Fire in the hills of Orange County covered over 16,500 acres and caused over $500 million of damage, 1993 money, while the Kinaloa Fire in the southern part of the San Gabriel Mountains, right on the edge of Altadena, was smaller but caused the outbreak's only fatality, a 98-year-old man who'd inhaled enough smoke to bring on a fatal attack of pneumonia. New York City elected its new mayor, with incumbent Democrat David Dinkins defeated by Republican Rudolph Giuliani, who profited from a perception that under Dinkins crime and particularly racial tensions had run rampant. The Maastricht Treaty came into force, creating the European Union on the 1st of November, and a couple of days later the UK Parliament passed the Railways Act 1993, which provided for the privatisation of British Rail. While Margaret Thatcher's government had been very keen on privatisation, having sold off British Airways, British Telecom, British Steel, British Coal, British Petroleum, BP, and the water and electricity monopolies, but public opposition had forced it to retreat from the idea of privatising the Royal Mail and British Rail. Now, however, the state railway would not be sold off as a going concern like British Airways had been, but split up into Railtrack, which owned, maintained and operated the infrastructure, a series of regional or route-based train operating companies who would in turn lease their actual trains from rolling stock owning companies. And a couple of days after the Australian Grand Prix, the ongoing war in Bosnia saw one of its most famous acts of destruction, as the 16th century Stari Most in the city of Mostar was shelled and destroyed by Bosnian Croat militia, as it was the only bridge over the Neretva River in the region, and was therefore being used by Bosnian government forces in a supply line. The bridge was reconstructed after the war and reopened in 2004. So the F1 gang arrived in Adelaide, but despite the circuit's popularity with the fans, the drivers, the teams and the media, it was rumoured its days might be numbered, as the state of South Australia had just passed an anti-smoking law that would ban all tobacco advertising. After some pleading, the circuit owners and governing body were given a pass until the end of 1995, but after that either the teams and their tobacco sponsors would have to agree to yet another race with no logos on the cars, or, more likely, the Australian Grand Prix would have to find a new venue in a different state. There were more developments for 1994 as well, with the technical regulations almost agreed, Max Mosley having stood his ground and insisted that all electronic driver aids would be banned, with the exception of the semi-automatic gearbox and car-to-pit telemetry, to which list had also been added Williams' continuously variable transmission and Benetton's four-wheel steering. Bernie Ecclestone, meanwhile, had also got his way in the face of opposition from some teams, particularly Sauber, and 1994 would see the reintroduction of in-race refuelling in the hopes of introducing a new wildcard element. Benetton, having for the moment at least given up on the idea of buying Ligier with Cyril de Rouvre's legal case showing no signs of actually having been decided yet, and had announced that for 1994 they would continue with Ford, who were building a new V8. The identity of the second driver was still a hot topic. Flavio said that in December the team would run a test of a number of drivers to make a final decision. Luca Badoer, Jos Verstappen, Olivier Panis and Eric Bernard were all on the dance card, as was JJ Leto, whose manager Keke Rosberg was still trying to find him a drive. Briatore also expressed an interest in Rubens Barrichello, but Eddie Jordan had seen that movie before and had him under a firm contract. Rubinho was also linked to McLaren, as Ron Dennis confirmed that Mika Häkkinen would be driving, but still hadn't named a teammate. He did talk to Alain Prost, but the professor was adamant. His mind was made up. Mark Blundell, a former McLaren test driver, was another name mooted, while Peugeot's stable of protégés included Yannick Dalmas, Laurent Aiello, and even Philippe Alliot, though his part ownership of Larousse might be an issue there. Andrea de Cesaris had been invited to seek other opportunities by Ken Tyrrell, who confirmed that the team would continue with the Yamaha Judd V10 and the equally accident-prone Ukio Katayama in 1994, and Andrea hadn't improved his case by going scuba diving and bursting an eardrum, which meant he would occasionally lose his sense of balance, which isn't great at over 100 miles an hour. Fellow veteran Derek Warwick meanwhile arrived for his last Grand Prix before retirement, absolutely riddled with the flu. Sid Watkins, fearing he might even have pneumonia, stopped him driving on Friday, and Jackie Oliver had just started talking to Christian Fittipaldi, in town to unsuccessfully try and get his Minardi drive back, about stepping in, when the indestructible Warwick walked into the pits on Saturday morning, dosed up to the eyeballs and coughing up a lung, but not about to miss his last Grand Prix, especially after his frustrating end to the last two. Riccardo Patrese, racing his 256th and last race, was as fit as a fiddle though, but without a contract for 1994, looked set to head for touring cars or endurance racing. But of course, all the talk was of the end of an era as Alain Prost retired and Ayrton Senna left McLaren to take his spot at Williams. Privately, Ayrton worried about his motivation in the future with no Prost. The media were all hoping for an emotional farewell scene between the two drivers, but Senna had been in such a foul mood after the Japanese Grand Prix that he'd rather blown off Prost's attempt to talk to him, so Alain said, "I have nothing more to say to him," while Senna, for his part, confided to his friends that he wanted to reconcile with Prost but didn't want to be publicly rebuffed if he made the first move. In fact, both drivers spent the build-up to the weekend, not unreasonably, with their teams, saying goodbye to everyone and participating in farewell drinks, dinners, speeches and so on. Alain Prost's mechanics cheekily presented him with a mounted clutch, while Ron Dennis jokingly wished Senna a nice holiday in Didcot. Friday saw Senna, despite all the mixed emotions he must have been feeling, laser-focused and on top of the timings, followed by Prost, Schumacher, Häkkinen, Berger and Hill, who was again learning the circuit for the first time and getting the hang of the setup. Saturday's times were mostly slower, although Hill had a great session, fastest of all and improving to third, and Ayrton Senna had his first pole of the year, ending Williams' run of 24 consecutive poles and preventing Prost from beating Mansell's record from last year. Prost and Hill would line up next, then Schumacher and Häkkinen, with the Ferraris of Berger and Alesi 6th and 7th, ahead of Brundle, as the prancing horse looked to secure 4th placed overall against the boys from Magny-Cours. Patrese could do no better than 9th for his final race, having failed to find a clear lap, and Aguri Suzuki again did well in the footwork, 10th despite a mistake. The Saubers were very twitchy over the bumps, while Barrichello with stomach pains and Warwick's flu saw them underperform a little, though still impressively in the circumstances. Eddie Irvine was rather less impressive, down in 19th behind both Tyrrells, while Gounod also had a much better session after fitness training between races and might have outqualified Martini if he hadn't been stymied by Berger on his last fast lap. The Loti were completely lacking in grip, and once again the Larousses had a raft of technical problems, so Toshio Suzuki would bring up the rear of the 24-car grid. Sunday morning's drivers' briefing ended with Ronald Brunscherider thanking Alain Prost for all he'd done and wishing him well for the future, which prompted a standing ovation from the other drivers, noticeably including Senna, and then they went off to get ready. The morning warm-up was unremarkable except for one incident, as Mika Häkkinen got a bit out of shape going into turn 10 onto the Brabham Straight and found himself launched across the curbs. Standing nearby was photographer Mark Sutton, who shot 5 frames on full auto. Once he'd had the photo developed, he realised he had one of the most iconic motorsport pictures of all time, inevitably dubbed the Flying Finn photo, which had come out absolutely pin-sharp despite the speed and motion and the relatively slow shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. The weather was cool and overcast, and everyone elected to start on the Supersoft D compounds, which Goodyear reckoned would mean a non-stop race, but by the time they were all on the grid and ready to go, the sun had come out and the track temperatures were beginning to rise. As they headed off for the parade lap, Martin Brundle's Ligier stalled, and he would have to start from the back, filtering round behind Suzuki to line up, but now Katayama was waving his arms, having stalled as he came up to his grid slot. The green flag was waved, but as the seconds ticked by, more hands went up and the start had to be aborted in a flurry of waved yellows. So, Brundle was wheeled back to 8th place on the grid, while Katayama was held until everyone else had left for the new parade lap and set off at the back. And with a lap chalked off, they reassembled. And then Eddie Irvine overshot his grid slot. So, round they went again, another lap was chalked off, and Irvine joined Katayama at the back. Third time lucky, and away they went, Prost getting a great start but not good enough, as Senna held the lead with Hill looking up the inside too. As they all charged through the first chicane, the curb-mounted camera caught Lamy being launched into the air off Katayama before spinning to a halt, causing Irvine in particular to have to get on the grass. Apart from the unlucky Portuguese driver, whose suspension had not survived the experience, everyone else was through, as Senna led Prost, Hill, Schumacher, Berger, Brundle, Häkkinen, Alesi, Aguri Suzuki and Wendlinger in the top 10 round the first lap of the now 79-lap race. The lap of Adelaide is a short one, and when the leaders came around, Lamy's Lotus was still there in a rather hazardous spot, but fortunately the marshals had managed to shift it by next time round, so no safety car was needed, as Senna began to extend his lead over Prost by half a second a lap. Hill, meanwhile, had Schumacher close behind and angling for third, though his case wasn't helped by a major wobble caused by hitting an oil puddle at Rundle Road on lap 4, which meant he also had to catch a slide coming onto the pit straight. But he gathered himself and set the fastest lap so far as he charged back towards the Williams. Martini's gearbox expired on lap 6, making him the second retirement, while Häkkinen, who'd dropped back at the start, had got motoring and passed Brundle, who'd had a great start but was now dropping back, returning to 8th place as Alesi came by too. The top 10 were already stringing out, with Senna now 2.7 seconds ahead of Prost, Hill 2.5 behind his team leader, Schumacher about a second behind Hill, Berger 6 seconds behind Schumacher, Häkkinen 2 seconds behind him, and Alesi and Brundle together another 3 seconds behind the Finn. There was a battle going on in 15th to 20th between Warwick, De Cesaris, Barrichello, Comas, Irvine and Katayama, but of course the TV coverage was watching Prost trying unsuccessfully to match Senna's lap times, and Schumacher gradually reeling in Hill. The latter two both rocketed past Herbert, who was cruising in to retire with a broken active suspension pump to end Lotus's weekend on a disappointing note. While the team was still looking at his telemetry, Irvine locked up and went straight on at turn 13. He hadn't hit the tyre wall too hard, managed to get back round to the pits, but he'd broken a front right wishbone, and that was that. Not a terribly distinguished weekend for the young Ulsterman after his heroics in Japan. They were all at it, apparently, Katayama going wide on lap 12 at the bend onto the Brabham Straight and wanging his suspension against the wall, so that was 5 out so far. While the cameras were watching Katayama's misfortune, Häkkinen had reeled in Berger and passed him. Then on lap 15, Schumacher dived in for tyres, a fantastic 4.8 second stop, getting him out still in 4th, having had a gap of well over 20 seconds back to Häkkinen. That gap was now just 6 seconds, but Schumacher was soon lapping faster and extending it again. Senna, meanwhile, had come across the first of the back markers, which had allowed Prost to close up a bit, while Alesi had now caught up to Berger, and a nice Ferrari battle had ensued. Schumacher's Ford V8 expired on lap 19, a disappointment for Benetton, for whom Patrese had had a really bad start and was down in 12th, so Häkkinen moved up to 4th, with the battling Ferraris now 5th and 6th, and all three some distance behind the lead 3, who were now covered by just under 8 seconds. But the sun was continuing to beat down and the track temperatures were soaring, which meant that those super soft D compound tyres everyone had on were degrading quicker than predicted, and the teams were doing some frantic recalculations, with almost everyone deciding to switch from a planned one-stop strategy to a two-stop, as Jean-Marc Gounon had his second spin of the day and, just like the first time, got going again. Hill was next in for tyres, getting back out just in front of Häkkinen on lap 23 as Berger followed suit, and unseen by the cameras, Häkkinen took third from the cold-tired Hill, who stuck to him as he warmed his boots up. Senna came in from the lead next time round, which put Prost out ahead, while Hill was looking for a way past Häkkinen, who wasn't about to let him through. Eventually, though, Hill's greater power told, and he got through at the end of the pit straight. Mika was in next time anyway, and kept 4th place. Prost, meanwhile, hadn't stopped yet and was a bit stuck behind Patrese, unable to extend his lead beyond 7 seconds over Senna, which wasn't going to be anywhere near enough to retain the lead when he did come in. On lap 29 he peeled in, and a longish stop saw him stationary for longer than the gap anyway, and put him back out second, some 14 seconds behind Senna. Häkkinen had been noticing his brake pedal becoming increasingly spongy ever since his stop, and came back in to have it looked at, but it turned out the problem was a broken left rear pump, which couldn't be fixed, so Mika's race was run. All of which meant that Senna led Prost and Hill with Alesi fourth, Aguri Suzuki up to fifth, having not stopped yet, and the Japanese driver had Berger bearing down on him, while Prost was now unsuccessfully trying to get past Blundell, which had allowed Hill to catch right up. As Suzuki finally went in for new tyres on lap 37, Gunon had his third spin of the day right in front of the two Williamses, and this time he stalled his engine and was out. The two Williams Renaults were the best vehicle on track at this point as they made their way through the traffic in formation, both gaining on Senna as he made his way through a big knot of cars. Half distance came and went though, with Senna still imperious in the lead and now free of traffic, getting his lead back up to 12 seconds, as it was Prost's turn to deal with Wendlinger, Suzuki Jr., Leto and Patrese in 7th through 10th places, while Hill made his second stop on lap 44, another mediocre stop by Williams, getting him out still third, but now 20 seconds behind. Alesi, Berger and Brundle, making up the top six, were also somewhat strung out, about 10 seconds between each of them, so actually the Wendlinger, Suzuki, Leto, Patrese scrap was about the most interesting thing happening, though in the McLaren pit, Ron Dennis and Senna's engineer Giorgio Ascanelli were having a bit of a set too about Senna's fuel consumption, and a marshal had to nip out into the pit straight to retrieve his hat, which had blown onto the track. Prost came in on lap 48 for what, unless something went wrong, would be the last tyre stop of his career. Again, a not too great stop and a hesitant getaway, losing him time, and he returned to the track 2 seconds ahead of Hill and 30 behind Senna. With both drivers now having made all their stops, Hill was charging, getting to within thousandths of the lap record on lap 50 and getting right up behind Prost. Patrese's stop was much tidier than Prost's, getting him out still 10th but just ahead of Marc Blundell, but the Ligier driver was unable to capitalise as he was in next time round, as was Berger, who held on to 5th. Senna was in with a lead of nearly 30 seconds on lap 54, getting out still well in the lead after a slick stop, while Prost was being held up by Aguri Suzuki, which helped Hill get right under his wing again. Now, there's never a good place for your throttle to stick open on a racing circuit, but JJ Leto had a particularly spectacular one when his did so at the end of the start-finish straight, launching him across the curbs and into retirement on lap 56. And as the last 20 laps began, Prost and Hill were still running close together, while Senna was now lapping 5th-placed Berger. Hill had a look on lap 62, but Prost was having none of it, while Senna was bearing down on Warwick and Blundell, now scrapping hard over 10th place. Both got smartly out of the way, unlike did Cesaris, though Senna made short work of him anyway. Berger was soon coming past too, as Warwick lapped the Tyrrell in turn. Lap 68 and Hill had another look at the end of the Brabham Straight, but got on the power a bit too soon this time, and his rear end stepped out. He kept it running, but by the time he got it pointing the right way again, having to stop and let the others go past, Prost and any hope of second place were long gone, though he was still far enough ahead of a one-stopping Alesi that his third place was never really in danger. Prost came past the battling Brits, still hard at it, as Senna started lap 71, while Patrese was hassling Aguri Suzuki for 8th place, both chasing 7th-placed Wendlinger, until the Austrian had a slightly more restrained version of his teammate's accident, a broken brake disc the culprit this time. Senna crossed the line to win his 41st Grand Prix. I misspoke last time and said that was number 41, and as Glenn Dix did his traditional acrobatics with the flag, it seemed appropriate that the two Ferraris came home in his wake, both a lap down, because as well as securing Ayrton Senna the runner-up spot in the championship, it also meant that McLaren overtook Ferrari as the F1 team with the all-time most wins, and from over 100 fewer races to boot. Prost came home second, Hill third, and following the Ferraris in 4th and 5th, their first double points finish all year, was Martin Brundle in the designer Ligier, with Suzuki 7th, the closest to the points he'd got all year. Patrese, meanwhile, ended his last race on a bit of a damp note as his fuel pump packed up on the last lap. He was a lap ahead of Blundell behind him, so he didn't lose a place, but he did have to walk back to the pits. Senna found himself a Brazilian flag as usual and celebrated by turning off his traction control and booting it through a couple of turns, though if Hill decided to follow suit it wasn't as successful. Whatever his problem was, he ended up pointing the wrong way and stalled. And so, an era ended, as Senna and Prost pulled into the Parc Ferme side by side. Ron Dennis helped Senna out of his car, and there were some words between them, as Prost hung around, possibly waiting to see if Häkkinen would come over, as Hill's Williams was pushed in. There was a handshake between Ron and Alain, clearly some warm words spoken, but eventually, as they all headed for the podium, and with both unaware they were being filmed, there was the handshake that the world's media had been hoping for. As the scrutineers got to work, the season's top three made their way out onto the podium as the race's top three. The Brazilian national anthem and God Save the Queen played, and the Brazilian, French and British flags waved both from the flagpoles above the podium and in the crowd. It hadn't been that one last big ding-dong battle that some had hoped for, and Prost would probably wish he'd won his last Grand Prix, but it was certainly a very satisfactory end to the season. The anthem's done, Senna shook hands with Prost for the benefit of the crowd, and then pulled him up onto the top step of the podium, followed by Hill, before the prize-giving, Ron Dennis beaming as wide as anyone on the podium. The traditional Moet and Chandon shower saw Joe Ramirez, Senna's fellow Brazilian and good friend, manage to get a taste. At the post-race press conference, both Prost and Senna were in a reflective mood, and after talking through the race itself, said they'd spoken before the race and agreed to draw a line under the past, concentrate on the good memories of their early collaboration, and while they hadn't planned any of the gestures made specifically, that was the place they were in now. Senna said that Ron had asked him as he got out of the car if he was sure he wanted to leave, and Prost laughed and said that was exactly what he'd said to him. Both drivers would meet up again in a month's time at Paris-Bercy for the Karting Masters organised by Philippe Streff, but that evening everyone who attended the race, fans as well as participants, had free tickets to Tina Turner's concert in town, with Senna dancing backstage, until he ventured on and got a rendition of Simply the Best dedicated to him. And so that was 1993, the end of an era in a number of ways, the end of the long careers of Prost, Patrese and Warwick, the end of Senna's tremendously successful 6 years at McLaren, but also the end of the era of high-tech electronics and even of the familiar sight of Camel's particular shade of yellow. 1994 would bring a whole new formula, with, it was hoped, driver skill and team strategy becoming more important thanks to the tech ban and refuelling. And with every major change in the regulations, there is always a chance for a shake-up, as the designers all want to be the one that cracks the new regulations.